Hey, Seth Lazar has been working for years on what he terms a normative philosophy of computing. Among other things, his work brings political philosophy to the AI world, looking at phenomena like what algorithmic intermediaries will do to human interaction and to governance. We discussed an approach he advocates for in understanding catastrophic risk and how AI relates to a broadly conceived idea of that risk. We also discussed a number of his other works and how they illustrate the approach he advocates for. I find Professor Lazar's work really interesting because he carefully considers not just how he'd like people to think about AI and its impacts, but how his work can guide practitioners and researchers in building systems conducive to a better society. This is the Gradient Podcast. I'm Daniel Bashir. The best way you can help me out with this project is by sharing it with people you know and by leaving ratings and feedback. And before we begin, this episode is sponsored by the world's first AI Quality Conference. Colina and the MLOps community have teamed up to host this event in San Francisco on June 25th about rigorous, reliable, and scalable AI. You'll hear about Cruise's recent AI efforts, as well as from speakers coming from Anthropic, Notion, OpenAI, and many other places. You can use the discount code Hallucinate to get 30% off their ticket price. And now, without further ado, Seth Lazar. I was thinking about a few different places to kind of lead into the interview today, and one that kind of struck me was, so we want to begin mostly by talking about your recent presentation on catastrophic risk, but it also struck me that when we're thinking about catastrophic risk, often in the debates, what's kind of made is this claim about where should we allocate resources, where should we allocate attention, and you've also thought about the allocation of attention in a pretty different way as well. And so I was actually thinking maybe we could start there. You have this great paper, Attention, Moral Skill, Algorithmic Recommendation, and you kind of talk about this attention allocation and, well, how that is a moral skill and a little bit different from some other sorts of things. And I'm wondering maybe we could introduce that and begin with that.
Yeah, sure. That sounds good. I think there's a nice set of questions with attention as well, where it goes like on the one hand, there's a question about what we'd call the ethics of attention, which is really about like how you should allocate your attention and maybe as well like what you should do in terms of influencing other people's attention, whether when that's okay and when not. Um, like what types of methods of distracting other people are morally acceptable and which aren't, for example. But then there's a broader question about the political philosophy of attention, where you really get to those points about the distribution of attention, which is, also relates very closely to these concerns around AI risk and harm. That the problem there is often seems to me to be regarded as one about, like you say, the allocation of attention. I think in that case, it's actually a bit of a false problem. I think we can walk and chew gum. And I think that the notion that attention is just this sort of fixed quantity that is zero sum is actually often mistaken. Especially when you're focusing on one particular narrow topic area. It's like, maybe if AI was the full sum of all the different things you could attend to, then it would be zero sum between sort of one type of risk and another type of risk. But like, given that AI is kind of eating up all of these other areas outside of AI that people would otherwise attend to, it's like a kind of growing pie.
One thing I'm kind of wondering, maybe we can talk about these two components, the ethics of attention and then the political philosophy of it, and lead in that way. But I suppose when in this paper, when you and the postdoc who led this are talking about attention allocation, one thing that was really interesting to me was the point that attention allocation can kind of on its own be good or bad, independently of whether it satisfies other sorts of prudential epistemic norms and things like this. So you give an example of like spying on a girlfriend to find out whether she's dating your friend or her friend or something like this. And the kind of conclusion is this feels icky. Like maybe it's good for you epistemically because you now know she's cheating on you, but this is like a bad allocation of attention. And I'm wondering if we can go into a little bit just when you're thinking about attention allocation as like an independent good or bad, how you think about justifying a claim like that and how it separates from some of these other things.
Yeah, good. So Look, I mean, in general, in moral philosophy, there's this kind of approach to thinking about the nature of reasons, which there's different approaches. One approach says that like they're kind of, in some sense, causally linked to some downstream value that you're trying to achieve. And there's another approach that says that what you're really doing is you're responding appropriately to something that calls for a particular kind of response. Um, that second approach is one that lends itself to thinking that like there's an intrinsic significance to the way in which we pay attention that isn't fully captured by all of its kind of instrumental importance. And it's worth saying that like obviously how you allocate your attention is instrumentally important, right? It's what leads you to do stuff. Like you can't take action on some particular topic unless you have attended to it first. So it clearly plays this instrumental role. But then we further argue that it actually has this sort of there's an additional element to it, which is like something can kind of call for you to attend to it. Like that is what it is, for example, to appropriately value it, is to attend to it, to take it seriously. I think you see this most acutely, and we feel this most acutely in those situations where you're on the street and you're confronted by somebody who is calling for your attention or who is suffering or is otherwise struggling, and like the idea of just sort of walking past, without, I mean, like whatever your views on what you ought to do, the notion that you just ignore a person who is suffering and kind of is there within your ambit, um, feels, I think, from a moral philosophy perspective and from an ethical perspective, certainly for me personally, to be just wrong. And like that's because that suffering, their nature as moral equals, like calls for you to attend to them, calls for you to do other things too. But one of the things it calls for is you to, it's also something we see a lot with our sort of intimate relationships. So as an example of this, um, I was like, I was so amused when Apple were putting out their first kind of publicity things about the Vision Pro, that it showed like a parent with the Vision Pro on with their kid in the room with like their spooky uncanny valley like screen eyes on it, like kicking a ball to their kid in the room. Like that is so clearly not attending to your child in the right way. Like your children call for your attention in a certain way that is just not adequately captured by a pass-through video on your screen. And even like, sometimes I'll forget that I'm wearing these headphones and I'll just kind of wander out. I work from home. My son's actually homesick today, and I'll go out with the headphones on, and he'll talk to me, and I'll have my headphones on in such a way that, like, obviously I've got them on pass through, but he doesn't know that I've got them on pass through, so he's not sure that I'm attending to him in the right way, and that also is like a little moral wrong for me to just fail to do it. So, like, our relationships can ground these calls for attention. The kind of the nature of other people's value can call for it, the moral significance of a particular topic can call for it. So yeah, I do think that there are ways in which the nature of our reasons is such that they can call for us to attend to them over and above the way in which they call for us to kind of do downstream things.
Yeah, and I guess in those like different situations, I'm thinking about, as you pointed out, for example, in the situation where you're crossing by somebody who is suffering and you don't attend to them, that seems wrong. And where we start here is like an intuition. And I guess I see this a lot in moral philosophy. And you talk about this, I think, in other places too, where some of these intuitions, these decisions we make, they ultimately ground out in something that's almost axiomatic about the equal worth of all human beings, for instance. And I guess for me that's interesting because when I think about doing moral philosophy, there's always this question of, we have intuitions, where did those intuitions come from? And almost all of my philosophy training is more in metaphysics, and we look for regress problems everywhere, like where does this ground out? And so when doing moral philosophy, I guess I'm curious if that kind of regress question is something you think about very explicitly, and like how you think about where the axioms you use come from and things like that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's obviously the whole field of meta ethics, and it's not something I work on very closely. I sort of follow it loosely. I work on it and I sort of understand it enough to know that like there are lots of different pathways to grounding it out, and I don't necessarily need to choose one. But more on the kind of normative ethics side, like the way in which I think that you make a compelling normative ethical theory is largely through the process of kind of coherentist justification. So it's about knitting together all of these different judgments across these different cases working them into a kind of a powerful theory that kind of explains and motivates them, and kind of helps you make kind of judgments about new cases that are more unfamiliar to you. So broadly speaking, it's something like what Rawls's process of reflective equilibrium that you've probably come across. I think is like the most plausible account of the kind of the epistemology of these types of moral judgments. Um, and I think also it's really important to kind of do the compare and contrast with competing moral theories. So, for me, for example, like my approach to morality generally is this very kind of deontological one, where, like you say, like most things ground out in my views about the equal moral worth of all people, and that we have this sort of fundamental moral status that connects up to, what we may do to one another, what we can be required to do ourselves. And so the main competitor to my kind of approach to morality is very much a kind of, consequentialist, especially utilitarian type approach, which really grounds out more in kind of welfare as its kind of key overarching value. Um, and the key thing for me to point out is just that, like, sometimes it's presented as though that alternative view, like, is more naturalistic or is more kind of explanatory. I think it just grounds out in a slightly different layer of normative bedrock. I think welfare obviously matters too. I think human moral status matters. In the worst case scenario, I have two elements in my grounding. They have one, which I don't think is a significant difference in terms of complexity. And so I think that I genuinely do think that, like, we're not going to get any more than this. Like, you're always going to hit normative bedrock fairly soon. So the best that you can do is build something on top of that bedrock that is kind of compelling in all of these different places. So it has this explanatory power that vindicates that choice of foundations.
That seems really like a reasonable way of thinking about it. I do feel that in metaphysics, there are ways you can kind of get yourself dug into these sorts of holes about like metaphysical economy. Like when I'm thinking about my grounding set of things that I believe exist, how many things exist in that set. And some people really care about this. And I think that when you look at features like parsimony, for example, as aspects of a theory, then sure, if one thing explains the set of observables, or is an equally powerful theory, but maybe uses fewer resources, then people view that as like a reason to prefer. But then you can go and ask the further question, well, why was this a reason to prefer in the first place? Also, for like a lot of the normative philosophy you're doing, as you're saying, this stuff doesn't like I think if the theory is powerful, that seems to be what matters most.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, you don't want to multiply entities unnecessarily, but the key thing is, like, are you explaining the judgments? And what tends to happen in moral philosophy is that when you go too far down the parsimony route, you just end up with bananas, bananas practical implications. And it's like, okay, no, you need, like, the right amount of entities in order to capture the phenomena. Um, I also think, look, it's worth saying another way of taking your original question is to sort of look at the kind of the source of intuitions themselves, and to cast some doubt on those considered judgments as, like, artifacts of various different forms of social enculturation. Um, and I think it is really important to have that kind of willingness to subject yourself to skepticism. I think this is actually particularly true when you're doing something like AI, working on something like AI, where you're often getting kind of really quite novel phenomena that nonetheless have some sort of kind of overlap, or kind of like seem as though they might be assimilated to something that you previously knew, where there's just like there can be a bit of a risk of status quo bias, which one needs to kind of be particularly alert to when it comes to sort of thinking about one's intuitions. So, just as an example of this, I think that, like, a lot of people have a real kind of ick factor with AI companions, and they think that, like, intuitively the notion of people forming kind of what are to them meaningful relationships with AI companions is just ick. And it's like, and I kind of had that too, to be honest. Like, if my kids sort of told me that they're having what they felt like was a meaningful relationship with their companion, I'd probably be like, going to get the screen time going on that. But, like, I don't necessarily trust that as an intuition in its own right, because it's a novel phenomenon. It's pretty easy to fall into status quo bias. So I do think that, like, while ultimately I don't think we can do without our considered judgments, it's certainly the case that we shouldn't just do like a sort of like a sit-in on our pre-theoretical commitments where we just take them as read and don't subject them to critical examination.
I want to circle back to this point and a little bit about our sort of intuitive disgusts, perhaps, for things like AI companions, because I think it'll be really interesting just to interrogate like the kinds of moral guides we have and how these kind of serve us and maybe do some sorts of disservice when we're faced with a lot of the different practices we're going to encounter when things like AI companions exist. But maybe we can kind of come back to the top level of the ethics of attention, the distribution of attention, and think a little bit about the catastrophic risks point and that larger debate, and then circle back into this. And I guess the way I'm thinking about this is when we think about the distribution of attention and the way things kind of pan out in that regard, one important point you made here was that in general, we've seen this kind of Overton window shift. The words like AGI or God like AI have kind of penetrated public awareness. They've come back into turn. And at the same time, there's some interesting things that are going on when it comes to the ways in which, for example, AI safety work, reinforcement learning from human feedback, this is a point you made, created the very systems that are now worrying people so much. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you saw some of this debate play out. I suppose it's interesting just to trace like the evolution of the AI safety community and how that's sort of played a role in, I suppose, mainstream AI discourse. But I'm curious how you've seen all of that.
Yeah, it's been very interesting. It's been a journey for me, and I think that so it's worth going back a little bit. Um, so my history with this starts out largely from the fact that I came into working on this topic in 2017, 2016, that sort of time, when as a philosopher working in this area, you constantly had to deal with the fact that the philosophers who had been most kind of prominent in working on it had this very kind of speculative at the time, technologically ungrounded approach to doing work on AI risk, where basically they argued from first principles that about the kind of the nature of superintelligence. And by the way, that those philosophers had behaved badly in various ways, and in particular, one of them, Nick Bostrom, is very probably a racist and has done some really bad things in that regard. So it was a crowd in that sense I didn't really want to be kind of much associated with. I didn't read Superintelligence. Frankly, I still haven't. I don't feel any particular need to. And I wanted to kind of start an approach to doing kind of philosophy of AI from the normative side that was much more grounded in the kind of the technical and empirical foundations that we could get from engaging with other disciplines. So, instead of taking this kind of scholastic approach where you just sort of sit in the armchair and think, what is the nature of AGI? Kind of like, I mean, very much like philosophers in the 15th, 16th century arguing about the nature of God. I took the view that well, that's okay to do with the nature of God because we're never going to get to, we're never going to have any empirical experience of God. So I think, and so you're never going to have your a priori argument kind of refuted or strengthened. Whereas with AI, there is a technology. Let's just talk about the technology rather than kind of talking about sort of made up versions of future technologies. So I came into it in that way, and that led me to engage with, with computer scientists, with social scientists working on AI, and very much to focus on kind of AI as it actually exists. Um, but my kind of guiding rule was always that I wanted to kind of have this technical grounding where, I'm happy looking over the horizon, but so it doesn't have to be only stuff that is currently out and being widely deployed, but it needs to have technical foundations in something that does exist. It needs to be something where I can say, okay, I'm not just making up this, so there's just no rules at all. It's this is a plausible extension of existing technologies. And essentially, what happened for me was that with the progress that's been made with LLMs, over the last 18 months, 2 years, um, what counts as within the sort of feasibility horizon of existing technologies has just radically changed. And so I went from a point where, it wasn't that I didn't think anybody should talk about catastrophic AI risk. I mean, people should talk about whatever they want to. It's not up to me to decide that for them. It just wasn't something I was interested in because the AI systems that were technically feasible at the time in sort of 2021, say, at least from my epistemic standpoint, just there was no way that they were going to pose those sorts of risks. So there's not a lot I could do about it. So whatever, it's fine. Just leave that to other people to talk about. And what I do think is true now with LLMs the way they are is that I still think they've got they're oversold in many ways. Like there is certainly a lot of hype around, but at the same time, I think that they make it clear that with the next generation, sort of next iteration, that's combination of methods that we can reasonably well anticipate, there is a very significant chance that they will be able to pose, at the very least, kind of novel risks at a societal scale. Um, I still think that there is a certain kind of catastrophic AI risk that would require such a sort of significant scientific advance that I don't think we can do an awful lot about it now, besides kind of build robustness and resilience. So, when you're thinking about real kind of, you know, recursive self-improvement, AI wakes up and decides no more humanity kind of stuff, like that kind of thing, I think, like, again, I'm certainly in a point where I don't like rule it out, but I also think that it would require a sort of significant scientific advance such that, you know, there's not an awful lot of point to my mind in working on it right now because, we'll work on it when we know more and we can work more productively on it. Again, no prescriptions around what other people should do. People should do whatever brings them joy. But yeah, so it's been that kind of sense that the advance in the capabilities of these systems, modulo some limitations, which we can maybe talk about, has meant that what is counted within the kind of the arena of like something I can legitimately engage with as a philosopher, um, has just expanded. And like we can perhaps talk about this, but I think that not everybody has maybe recognized not everybody has maybe got the same kind of heuristics about what to work on. And I think that you started talking about the kind of the possibility of this being like a zero sum question of like which types of risks we attend to. I kind of want to push back against that idea and to open up space for making this much more positive sum.
I like that. One thing I picked out in the way you were articulating yourself a little bit earlier when it comes to these arguments about, say, recursive self improvement, and this is something that I think I noticed and probably a lot of other people as well, is there's this similarity to, say, ontological arguments for the existence of God that are kind of latent in some of these arguments for superintelligence. And I think that's really interesting and actually kind of important from a theory of change perspective, because it does feel like when you look at effective altruists and people who are really interested in existential risk, specifically from AI, they have done a really good job from a theory of change standpoint in terms of there's lots of money flowing around that group and the uses to which it has been put. You might have debates about, but it is worth saying that they have acquired an incredible amount of influence. And that's pretty important from that perspective. But also, I think bringing this back to your own work and looking at normative philosophy, like grounding things empirically and doing things that way, also seems very important from that theory of change perspective, but also from the like, I actually have to convince people perspective. Linking that back to the ontological argument, I think that one of the problems people always point out is technically it's like an internally consistent argument, but I feel like if you're not already there with the premises or with the conclusion, then it's not likely to get somebody on board who's not already on board. And I do feel like the superintelligence thing inherits some of those same issues. But I'm curious how you think about some of those differences.
Yeah, I mean, look, and again, people should do whatever they like. Like, on the whole, I mean, I think that we should acknowledge if prominent figures in the debates we're engaging with have done bad things, and I think that's one thing that like more people could do. Um, I think we have that. Unfortunately, we have that in philosophy all the time. Lots of lots of bad men in philosophy, and it's important to call them out. One thing that I always do, for example, is if anybody's going to bring up Heidegger in a philosophy seminar, I'm always in there. Just like to point out, massive Nazi. So I think we do need to do that. I need to remember that. But look, I think these kind of paradigm independent, kind of purely philosophical approaches, um, for me, are a bit pointless. I mean, like you say, people have been motivated to spend lots of money on these grounds. So obviously, it works for something. As a sort of as an intellectual project, I'm not super interested in it, just because I think that like you know in those cases, like often you're just going to over-index on present capabilities, and like whatever the present, like you may think you're doing a priori reasoning, but actually you're just going to overgeneralize from your current experience of the technology. So that's going to happen, and if the technology changes, then things are going to go a bit different. And I think in a way we see this a little bit, like I said in that talk, with concerns about like reward misspecification and paperclip type worries, which were very kind of driven by the prevalence of reinforcement learning within the framework for thinking about AI at the time. Now that we're thinking that we might be using kind of language models as the underlying kind of reasoning engine, it seems much easier to incorporate an element of common sense in those that clearly wouldn't do that sort of like nutty, crude maximization. So I think one risk is that you over-index, even though you think you're doing a priori reasoning, you over-index on the present kind of empirical state of the art. But let's say that you successfully guess something about the nature of this future technology. Um, like I think in almost every case, when we actually learn more about the technology, like what your guess will basically become redundant because we'll have an empirical basis to go from. So like maybe it will have helped kind of allocate resources preemptively in a certain direction, like possibly. But actually, once we actually have something empirical to work with, we kind of, it's not like you have the empirical evidence and you've got the a priori argument, and you're like, oh, I've got to weigh these two against one another. It's like, no, once you've got the empirical evidence, you don't need the a priori argument anymore. And if it pulls in the opposite direction from the empirical stuff, reject it. So I think it has that kind of like when it goes well, when it's accurate, it's redundant, and it's like not that likely that it's going to be accurate because you're just you're pulling ideas out of your proverbial. On the whole, it's like it seems like an investment of intellectual resources that doesn't have the kind of payoff in terms of truth that you might want. Now, it obviously has been very effective at mobilizing a few people to coordinate the distribution of resources in a particular way. EA has lots of things going on with it. I think that it's in a year where there's been a lot of kind of reckoning and discussion, which I think is good to see. I think like any fairly kind of tight-knit social movement over time with lots of resources, there are always going to be problems around accountability and power, and we've seen those come out in the last year. And I think that that's led to a certain amount of opening up that I think is just kind of beneficial for everybody, including for the EAs themselves. But yeah, it is. I mean, it certainly is an oddity and a curiosity that some of the. I mean, like I say this in a charitable way, kind of some of the wackiest philosophers who were around Oxford at the time I was there in 2008-9, who frankly a lot of people would have thought like, that were doing some of the work that was in a way like least sort of impact focused, have ended up having such a big impact on the world, and as to whether it's a good impact or not, I don't, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I certainly think the bed nets are good. No complaints with bed nets and deworming and all those sorts of things. Like I think EAs definitely do a lot of good. And like, for that matter, I think individually EAs are making far more kind of noble sacrifices than I am. So there's a lot of virtue there. But yeah, it is kind of bananas how some of these very abstract philosophical arguments have achieved such traction among that community. And like in that respect, I think is an interesting result for philosophy.
I agree. Yeah. There's a lot of, I guess, historical contingency to that, I feel. But I want to circle to something that you had mentioned earlier as a very important point about pushing back against the zero sum nature of focusing attention on current harms from AI and long term harms. Because there's some interesting ways to kind of go about this, and I think that you bring in a few. For example, the fact that the increased focus on existential risk, the campaigns we've seen recently, gave a lot more political capital to some of the movements for AI regulation, which is really important. And you also, I think, highlight a pretty important asymmetry that I was wondering if you could expand on, which was that attacking current harms from AI systems, this doesn't undermine efforts to reduce risks from future AI systems. And I think that there's a lot of the empirically grounded ways of doing prediction that you talk about here. But you also say that the reverse isn't exactly true. And I suppose when I think about it from the perspective of maybe a lot of doing things in this far out ways takes the form of abstract philosophizing or a priori arguments. That's kind of the asymmetry I see you poking at, but I'm wondering if that sounds right.
Yeah, so it's not quite. It's more like look, I think there's two different types of zero sum kind of argument, right? One is just the distraction, attention type argument, and one is the kind of concrete policy proposals type argument. Um, I think the distraction slash attention one is just wrong because ultimately it is not a zero sum. Like attention in this particular case is not zero sum. Like if you think about attention, the global sum of total attention, like maybe that is itself like zero sum. Like people can only attend to so much stuff. There's only so many people. The share of that pie that is focused on AI and AI policy is just a slice of that pie, and that can very clearly increase, and it has been increasing. And I think that so I think that it can be additive in the sense that you can still talk about all of the things that still attend just as much to all of the concerns that people were concerned about before, whilst also attending to these other risks. And it can also be multiplicative in as much as they can sort of work to compound each other. And yeah, I think that the reality of the last kind of year of AI regulation is that when people have pulled in the same direction, I think that there has been a kind of, like a sort of coattails effect. People will dispute which is on the coattails of which, but I definitely think that AI policy has progressed a lot more in the last year than I expected it to, and that is at least in part as a result of this kind of growing clamor around some of the more kind of catastrophic risks from AI systems, especially as over the last year that has moderated towards focusing on things like chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear weapon risk, cyber risk, those sorts of persuasion, democracy type risk, those kinds of concerns that are kind of where you can see a direct causal pathway from existing AI systems and sort of maybe next generation with some predictable improvements leading to those risks, as opposed to the ones that are more speculative and are based on assumed scientific advances that will take place. So I think that's the kind of the attention side of it. The policy side of it is like, yeah, so straight up, I think that every single policy proposal that has been made, or good policy proposal that has been made to address current AI harms, will like improve and advance the cause of reducing sort of later risks from AI systems, both ones from kind of within the existing kind of feasibility horizon and those that are kind of beyond that. Like I don't think there's any kind of conflict there in particular. Like it's all about, if you think about the conference that I do a lot of work with, the Fairness, Accountability, Transparency Conference, all of these policies that are aiming to achieve those goals will advance other goals with respect to AI. So in that sense, I think that it's just a good thing to do, kind of like whatever your agenda is. Now, there are some policy proposals around reducing risk from future AI systems that I do think have potential negative impacts now. I don't think that they are ones that are like by any means kind of necessary for advocates of reducing risk from future AI systems to adhere to. So I think that there is a version of these policies that doesn't have these costs, but sometimes they will. So in particular, I mean the proposals to reduce and restrict the release of model weights, which are for the most part they're really motivated by concerns about releasing the weights of like future, much more capable AI systems, and the prospects of proliferation that might entail. With existing systems, like there obviously are big concerns with things like the creation of deepfakes, but the ship has already sailed very much with that, and kind of image generation and video generation in that sense. Like that's going to be a very hard thing to prevent proliferation of. In general, I think that open source right now, and open weights rather, is extremely important for mitigating the kind of current and near-term risks from AI systems, just because it's our best means of reducing the centralization and concentration of power. Now, if we had amazing markets and competition regulators and like other means for preventing the centralization of power, then maybe you wouldn't need to have open weights. But at the moment, unfortunately, we just are terrible at creating kind of competitive markets from scratch. We're seeing this a ton at the moment. Like, Microsoft has just eaten up Inflection. And, like, will that get attention from the FTC? Well, not in the way that it would normally, because it isn't a merger. They've just taken the talent, or some of the talent. Um, so, I think that in the absence of like really good functioning markets, I think that open weights are really important for reducing concentration of power. And I think that folks who are arguing against open weights out of a concern about future AI harms should, I think, instead be kind of rowing back from that and saying, okay, we need to build in some readiness, some awareness, so that we're not just releasing the weights kind of willy nilly. Like, we need to do so in a situation where we're not kind of worried about these systems then being able to be used to pose very significant risks. But when we are kind of confident that we're in a pretty safe situation, which we should be right now, we shouldn't be limiting that. We should be encouraging it because, frankly, it also advances safety research and alignment research, because it's super hard to do really good alignment research unless you have access to model weights, as well as, frankly, training data.
It's interesting just to trace this back because the discourse around model weights are too unsafe to release. It's too unsafe to open source this model. That's been going on since GPT-2. And I remember when OpenAI first refused to release it publicly. And then if I remember correctly, two master's students or something ended up reproducing GPT-2. And then there wasn't very much they could do about it. But it's just interesting to me now seeing how the debates and the sides, how that all kind of flows out from that really some of these really early decisions, I suppose, to articulate oneself in this way around we think this is really dangerous. And that is pretty consistent, I suppose, with what I understand a lot of people at OpenAI's positions to be on this sort of problem. But it is interesting just to kind of trace that historical evolution, and you wonder, it's of course hard to assess and think about counterfactuals, but maybe had they thought about things a little bit differently or made a different decision from what they did with GPT-2, would the debates today be different? It's very hard to evaluate.
Yeah, I mean, I think with GPT-2 and that original debate, um, there was also the dimension of like no one else has this technology at all. So I think it was a very different landscape in that regard, because by kind of not releasing it, you can then ensure that like no one actually is able to do any of this sort of stuff. Um, and you can see the sort of the rationale for that. Um, I think that like we have way more examples to look at. We have, we've got a year of having had a GPT-4 level model out there that people can use at the very least, like without access to the weights. But certainly people have tried to do all sorts of stuff with it. I think we have more of a sense of what those capabilities are. I think that like it would be pretty surprising now if someone were able to get a GPT-4 level model to do something, something really novel after people have been banging away at this for the last year. So I think that it's just about having this kind of proportionate response, where you consider these things like in the light of your full kind of evidence base. You think about what the real risks are. You recognize the massive benefits. I don't have any particular beef with companies that want to keep their models closed. Like, I think it's unfortunate from a scientific perspective, but at the end of the day, it's hundreds of millions of dollars have gone into training these models. Like, you can't exactly then say, "Oh, I'll make it free for everybody." Like, I can understand that. But I do think that kind of limiting the ability of other companies to do stuff open in a more open source way, if not the whole way open source, especially when that's done out of a concern for a set of risks that I think, like I say in that presentation, really depend on some non-trivial scientific advance happening. That for me is disproportionate, and in particular, it undermines this ability to reduce the concentration of power that I think is so crucial with AI technologies in general.
I feel like the power and economics parts of the arguments are such important ways to come at this all, because another thing you pointed out in the presentation was this cognitive dissonance in a lot of these big AI companies about we are maybe a little bit worried about these future AI systems, but we are trying to build towards AGI anyway. And I felt this was really apparent, I think, in there's a New York Times article, I want to say, by Kevin Roos, where he went and spent a couple of weeks at Anthropic and then published this massive article, and I think the front image was like Dario Amade or something, like bathed in red, and it was called "Inside the White Hot Center of AI Doomerism," and just painted like such a fascinating picture of what it was like to be inside one of these places where everybody is like, we are building this powerful system, and we are also like really scared of this powerful system. And it was interesting you brought up that cognitive dissonance, because one thing that came up for me was when I think about what one of the people inside these companies would say to that, they would probably point out that, well, we have this like massive coordination problem, right? Because if we stop building the AGI, somebody else is going to get there first, and then we don't get to, I don't know, have our say in terms of what that looks like. I guess Anthropic is a particularly interesting case just because they've pursued some of these ideas around like a publicly sourced constitution, for example. I know they've at least begun to explore things like this, but I'm curious how you think about some of those like interrelations between it does seem a little bit dissonant here, but then there's also the angle of like people within these communities, within these companies are thinking from it as a game theory angle, but then it's also sometimes a little bit hard to trust what they say because, as you pointed out, there are these angles of power and economics that are also driving these decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think on the Anthropic side of it, um, look, I think they're doing really interesting research, and I think that their case for what they're doing, the notion that you need to be at the frontier of the technology in order to do the safety work, I think is pretty well justified and pretty actually vindicated by what's happened in the last year. I think if you contrast their approach, and frankly even OpenAI's approach, with the new companies that have sprung up in the last year, both from the big tech companies finally kind of, turning their attention to this, and from sort of newer labs and places like Nvidia that are kind of now doing the kind of the AI development as well as the hardware. Um, you don't see anywhere near that level of kind of conscientiousness around the ethics and safety part of it. Like from the beginning, researchers at OpenAI and Anthropic have done like really interesting and useful ethics and policy and safety research. That research has been going out into the academic community and into the public interest community. Um, and I think it would be really unduly cynical to sort of describe it as being like motivated by profit or whatever. Like they're now big companies that undoubtedly like these incentives all get kind of mushed up together, and that will affect different individuals in different ways. But the academic research they produce, I think, has been extremely useful to the sort of the kind of the ethics and safety research communities. And the example you gave at the end there of the publicly sourced constitution is a really good case. I think constitutional AI is very cool. Um, what concerns me really much more than Anthropic and OpenAI is the fact that of the seven most capitalized companies in the world right now, five have teams that are building towards AGI, so they say. And like the other one is one of the other two is Apple, which like if they're not will be in some way. Um, like I'm concerned about that level of power and resources working on this topic. Whilst their chief scientists and whoever are sort of signing these statements about catastrophic AI risk, I think that should generate a bit of cognitive dissonance in us and as kind of political communities. Um, I'm also concerned about another type of AI startup that has come out in the last year, where people have been doing very interesting work on trying to sort of operationalize LLMs to make them the executive center of different kinds of agents, whether software agents or robot agents. Um, and like this may be my ignorance, but I keep looking at these startups to try and see whether they've got anybody there who's working on ethics and safety and policy and those sides of it. And I can't see them, and I see them hiring lots and lots of people. I don't see them hiring anybody in responsible AI. Um, and that concerns me a lot because, like, all of the novel risks from these kind of more capable AI systems will be significantly exacerbated by creating more autonomous systems that can do sort of long sequences of steps without direct supervision. So that is really if you're talking about the white hot center, that's the white hot center of AI risk. Um, and I just see these companies coming out doing their seed rounds, getting all this funding. Um, and it feels to me like they haven't learned the lesson of previous generations of technology development, which has all said that you need to think about this stuff at the front end. Before, like, as in, like, before you get this stuff, you need to front load your thinking about this stuff before you start just kind of deploying things, putting out demos into the world, you really need to be thinking about this kind of the responsible dimension of it. And that actually is an area where you have to give OpenAI and Anthropic their dues. Like they actually were thinking about these things all the way from the beginning, right back to that GPT-2 release that you mentioned. Many missteps along the way, no doubt, and we can all kind of like hop on those from the sidelines. But I think that there's no doubt that I would rather have kind of those sorts of companies at the forefront of the technology than ones that are just doing kind of nothing to consider the societal impacts of the systems that they're building.
I'm in full agreement with that. And one interesting thing about the startups you mentioned, I don't know if this is exactly the same set, but I do recall a lot of founders of early stage AI companies were posting publicly about how they were actively refusing to take funding from venture capitalists who were in any way associated with some of those statements about AI safety. They were calling them, D cells, for example. And I think a lot of these people were folks who maybe self-identified with like effective accelerationism, for instance. And I find that just really fascinating as a creed in and of itself. But to what you're saying when it comes to some of these dangers as well, a lot of these people are building agentic AI systems that could do a lot of interesting things, a lot of harm, a lot of good as well, possibly. But it does feel like there's this tunnel vision where it feels almost religious in some ways to me, I suppose, when I hear the way it articulates itself. But it's that, I'm sacrificing a lot to build something that is going to be good for humanity. And there's like a lot of different ways I feel like one could kind of come at the psychology of somebody who is making a statement like this or situating themselves in this way. But I did find that like a pretty interesting trend.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I should say as well, like, I didn't mean to cast too broad a brush. There are definitely some new AI companies that are also putting kind of safety and policy at the forefront. So it's worth kind of singling out those and praising them, like companies like Imbue, for example, which is doing the agentic stuff and but is really thinking about this from the ethics side and has got like they've done good research on the ethics side of things as well, besides just kind of the implementation and policy part of it. Um, but on the other hand, when I look at companies like, and I'm looking at companies like Adept or Cognition, this new one, or Figure, or the Gear Lab at NVIDIA. Um, you know, if anyone who listens to this is from those labs and has and knows the AI safety people, the ethics people who are there, and they want to talk, I would love to talk to them about their research and sort of plug them into this kind of broader community of researchers working on these topics. I think it really does benefit from that. If they don't have people who are working on these areas yet, and they just haven't got around to it yet, then I'll connect them with people. Like this is not intended to be adversarial. This is intended to be like, this is something you really need right now. I want to help you kind of achieve that. Um, and look, there are some very obvious cases besides just the intrinsic ethics one for doing this. Like it's the right thing. Like we've already seen the instrumental value of doing safety work. Like the reality is that 2 weeks before ChatGPT went public, um, Facebook or Meta put out Galactica and had to take it down within 3 days because it was just trivially easy to get it to say super toxic and unpleasant things. Like talk about the health benefits of eating crushed glass or why everything is the fault of the Jews. And like the safety and alignment work that was done through RLHF and rules-based reward modeling and those sorts of things, like to enable ChatGPT to just not be super toxic all the time is the reason why it's a functional product. And like it's the reason why we're going to have this sort of, potentially multi-trillion-dollar economy of work kind of coming out of LLMs. It is because of the safety and alignment research. It's a little bit ironic because obviously the safety and alignment researchers are mostly motivated by wanting to avoid kind of acceleration. It actually has led to acceleration. But I think it is actually a good thing. I think that there will be lots of useful, kind of lots of value, like real human value that comes out of it. So there's that instrument. There's also the instrumental point about like, at the end of the day, if you don't take care of this stuff at the front end, there's going to be a scandal. You're going to end up in a big regulatory kind of hole. You can see that sort of lesson from social media, and that kind of dimension of it where failure to take into account of these things ahead of time just led to a ton of problems, a ton of backlash, I mean, the whole techlash was a response to that. That lesson should really be remembered more quickly. And then for those who have this kind of, the sort of God complex of, we're going to create something that is for the benefit of humanity. This is where I think some of the political philosophy work that I've done is really important. And it's like the key thing to focus on is like, you may have your views about like what's good for humanity, and like that's fine. Everyone has their views, but like, why do you get to decide? These radical changes in the rest of in how everybody else lives. Why does it get to be you who makes that decision? Like, it's not enough that you want to be doing the right thing with the power that you have. You actually have to have the authority to be in that position to make those decisions. You have to do it in the right way as well. So that's where I think like, it's worth just kind of talking to people and saying, yeah, look, doing the right thing is not just about doing the thing that you believe is right. It's also about thinking about the power that you have and whether you are appropriately exercising that power, like whether you should have that kind of power.
Yeah, that's an important point you make in other ways as well and in other places about who is the right person to be making decisions about the algorithmic systems we're going to use and the ways those will play in our lives. And we don't even have to go far back to find analogies for this, right? I mean, we were having these same sorts of debates about Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, and it's like, do we want him to roll out of, on the wrong side of the bed or something and make a decision that affects world leaders and a bunch of us around the world? The irony point you made was interesting too, when it comes to the ways in which like instruct tuning that produced ChatGPT and the thing that scared a bunch of people, because I've heard the argument made before that people will make this dichotomy between model capabilities and alignment or safety, and some people will make the argument that capabilities just are safety. And I don't want to paint too broad a brush here. There are specific people I've heard make this argument, and I don't think that everybody on, say, the accelerationist side agrees with that necessarily, but I've heard that before. And the irony point you made is an interesting case where I guess it's like the reverse is kind of true. In this case, like safety actually improved the capabilities in a pretty important way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so just to go to both of those points, um, it is funny the kind of the morality tale of Musk taking over Twitter is just kind of striking. Like we were all saying, like 3 years ago with Zuckerberg, like, oh, you don't want to have all of your like these fundamental decisions about the kind of digital public sphere being in the hands of one person. But at the same time, like in retrospect, it kind of looks like it was being pretty responsible, you know, like relatively speaking. Like, oh, I don't know. I mean, gosh, like the oversight board's actually pretty cool. Certainly, if you contrast that with like, you know, Elon Musk who just, wants to be as based as he can possibly be or whatever, and just, just decides to do something for the lols. But in all of these cases, yeah, like you don't want really significant decisions about your society in any dimension being made by unaccountable individuals, and that's like something that one has to be conscientious about in designing new technologies, because at the end of the day, that is an extraordinary amount of power. Like if you create something that like, you know, completely changes the nature of personal computing, for example, which is a pretty decent candidate for something that we're going to get in the next like 18 months or so. Like to the degree that we just start using like all of our digital, like we no longer have apps, we no longer have operating systems. We literally just have an agent that operates as an intermediary between us and all of the digital services that we use. Like that is a radical, radical transformation of our lives, and like you don't want to be like thinking that like, oh, I'm going to do that for the better, and my decision on what's appropriate is sufficient. Um, and like, if you do, then in time, we the rest will just tell you like, hey, actually, that's not cool. We're going to take control of that now. Thanks very much. So it's something that will happen eventually, and it's better to do it at the front. Um, the point about the kind of the distinction between capability and safety, yeah, look, I don't think that there's a hard and fast conceptual distinction between these things. That you can go a little bit down the kind of, the philosophical route with this if you want, and start talking about like the orthogonality thesis, and the idea that like if you're going to get to it like a kind of, do you have that like Kantian view that achieving a certain level of rationality just entails understanding morality, or do you have that kind of more, I guess, Humean view that rationality and morality are just these two completely different things, and there's no reason to think that an optimally rational agent would have any sense of morality? I think it's a fun debate. Like Hume and Kant didn't resolve it. So I don't think we're going to. But it's certainly, I mean, I do think that we get interesting evidence. Like one of the things I think is kind of bananas about LLMs is that they actually have like really, really good moral judgment. I mean, obviously not in like an operational kind of way, but if you talk about like a series of cases or vignettes to an LLM, and you ask it to like a good one, and you ask it to parse the morally relevant considerations, and to sort of synthesize those into a judgment of what to do, they're like amazingly good. um, sort of, definitely graduate student working in moral philosophy level good, and I think like, you know, as to the level of their kind of their judgment, if you like, their sort of their practical wisdom, that I think you can prompt them in different directions, and they can do a decent job. But yeah, so I think like it's we will get interesting evidence about this question of the relationship between capabilities and safety. I don't think it's one that we can resolve a priori.
This is maybe a bit of a methodological question for you, based off of something you mentioned earlier about you think it's reasonable that we could see, for example, a very fundamental change in the nature of personal computing, say in the next 18 months. And I suppose there's two ways I'm looking at it, because one thing about like the nature of a radical fundamental change in something is that when we're on the other side, like it's very hard to know what that is going to look like. But on the other hand, as you say, there are these feasibility horizons. And so maybe we can make reasonable predictions about what 18 months from now might look like, and maybe slightly less reasonable predictions about what 5 years, what 10 years on might look like. And there's, I guess, the notion of like uncertainty in the predictions we make. And then when we're thinking about, doing moral philosophy and things like this, and we want to do things that are actually useful for people implementing the systems as well, while also, as you say, in your normative philosophy, doing this first order philosophical work. I'm curious how you think about the interactions of those like uncertainties, and when you're aware that things could just totally change and be unrecognizable to me at some point in the future, how that kind of factors into the way you do normative philosophy.
Yeah, I think it's a really important thing to get one's head around, and it's definitely a challenge. Um, so the way I think about it is less about timelines, and those sort of time horizons, and more like this concept I've used a couple of times, is sort of feasibility horizons, where the basic idea there is that like you're thinking about the outcomes that can be sort of expected on the basis of like existing systems and the sort of the normal science type improvements on them. So stuff that you can anticipate, like so, for example, with existing LLMs, their obvious shortcomings are around reasoning and planning. So an obvious thought is that you would find ways to kind of backfill those limitations by drawing on kind of other parts of AI that are better focused on reasoning and planning, and developing these kind of hybrid systems where, LLM might be the kind of the executive center, but it's drawing on these other tools in order to perform various functions. Now, no one like people have got like versions of this to work with, like the Devin kind of software engineer demo, which is like really, really interesting, really exciting. And I think we're seeing some similar things with some of those humanoid robots. So people are sort of getting versions of this going. So you can kind of anticipate pretty well like what will be feasible through that. And that's all in the sort of what one calls kind of normal science, like building on what we already know. I think also scaling is part of normal science. So, like some people obviously do think that like we'll just scale and like poof, everything will change. So I don't think that's very well supported by the history of scaling. I think that some of these limitations have not gone away or changed or been reduced by it, but I think it's a reasonable discussion to have. Um, so then, like within that sort of feasibility horizon of the sort of the normal science developments, that's one kind of thing. Beyond that, beyond the current feasibility horizon, is stuff that relies on some significant scientific advance. Now, that scientific advance could, like, for all I know, it could have happened and we don't know about it, right? So this is why I feel sort of hesitant about saying like 5 years, 10 years, whatever. Like if we could predict scientific advances of that nature, then I could I'd probably be rich, right? Like you could just bank on it in various ways. So I think that scientific advances are inherently unpredictable. You should have a very kind of fuzzy credences over when they're going to happen. That should allow for the possibility they might happen very soon, but they also might never happen or might happen in 50 years' time or whatever. And my main reason for doing sort of less work on things beyond the feasibility horizon is that I think when you don't know the nature of the technology that you're trying to influence, it's just really easy to like waste your time or to incur these really significant opportunity costs, or to kind of, it leads to kind of tolerating certain kinds of grift and deception and co-optation, and I just think that like there are tons and tons of pitfalls to working on mitigating risks from technologies that we don't yet understand. That's not to say that you don't do anything. It's just to say that like you probably try and do stuff that is going to be robust across a range of different eventualities. Um, and for the most part, I think that's going to mean doing things that kind of really kind of work on the feasibility within the feasibility horizon. So like when you're working on problems within the feasibility horizon, you can kind of you get feedback. You can know whether things are working. You can know like that you're not wasting your time, and you can make these reasonable judgments about opportunity costs. So I think that when you're then thinking about like what can you actually do in order to kind of prepare for the sort of risks that might come from future technologies that you don't yet fully understand. Um, I mean, it's hard for me to see that there's like a better strategy than building up like a robust, resilient kind of set of research communities, regulations, norms, practices, markets that deal with the risks from technologies that we do understand. Like it seems to me that like that is just your best bet for both things. Like, and the idea that like it wouldn't be, I think it'd be interesting to see how that argument would go. So that's where I think that like it's important to I think there are kind of limitations with the field of AI safety as it's currently practiced, where I think that it could be slightly reoriented towards doing more of that. Which let me be clear, it's not about saying focus on current harms. Like that's not the point here. Like current harms would be part of the story for sure, but the point is focus on the risks from technologies that we pretty well understand. And I don't mean that we understand like precisely what's going on inside the neural network. I mean like stuff that exists, stuff that is empirical, stuff that we can test, stuff where we can see where normal science will take it. This actually is what like Anthropic, for example, take as their approach. They call it empirical AI safety. They have in their responsible scaling policy, they have their different levels of risk, and the level 4 is the more speculative one, where they basically say we can't really do an awful lot about this right now. I completely agree with them on that. And I do think, though, that if you're going to start taking seriously risks from systems that we within that feasibility horizon, there are ways in which the field of AI safety needs to mature a bit. In particular, insofar as it needs to go beyond these sort of narrowly technical parts of the field, which are like important and totally worth doing, but it needs to build on those by building in a more socio-technical approach.
Yeah, I want to get into that in a moment, but first, I want to understand maybe even a little bit better how you understand feasibility horizons, because the case in point here, when we're looking at scaling and GPT-3 and all of this, we came up with terms like emergence for a reason, right? I mean, they're like you could trace this back and say, from one perspective, maybe the moment that we had language modeling as a paradigm, the moment that we began scaling that up, then everything further along, GPT-3, GPT-4, everything we will see now on as we follow, if we call this, monolithic scaling or something, that's all like within the feasibility horizon, in the sense of we are following the same scientific paradigm and not making like a fundamental change in some ways. But at the same time, it feels reasonable to say, if you go far back enough, like nobody predicted what the capabilities would look like coming out of GPT-3. And, we had to come up with all these terms like emergence, and some people have different opinions on whether emergence is a term one should use. But nonetheless, people were surprised enough that now, if we turn the clock back, it feels reasonable to say like very few people, maybe you had Rich Sutton and the Bitter Lesson of predicting this a little bit, but it does feel safe to say like nobody really, really predicted all of this in one sense. And so when I'm thinking about like feasibility horizons, then it still feels open to somebody to say, maybe there is something that exists within the scope of like this scientific paradigm that could technically be within feasibility horizon, but that or like scientific consensus or like the mass group of people who are thinking about this just can't imagine. And so I'm curious if that's something you think about when you're thinking about feasibility horizons.
Yeah, for sure. I think it sort of actually helps to kind of pinpoint that as like just a really interesting and important question. Um, and I think that like so the way I think about that is that um, if one does believe that like scaling is all you need, and that like we're just going to get there through, like you said, monolithic scaling, we're going to have these significant capability jumps. You know, I think that's kind of it's not unreasonable. It's not kind of where my kind of balance of probabilities lies because of some of these sort of limitations around kind of what people call like the embers of autoregression. Like I think that it's likely that those will continue just on sort of theoretical grounds, but you never know. It's certainly possible that that would happen, but I do think that it would be true that like the character of the systems that come about from this scaling would be kind of sufficiently different from existing systems at this scale that it would be very, very, very hard to have any confidence in measures that we take that are kind of suitable or fitting or kind of helpful for systems like now to be relevant for systems at that kind of level of capability. So the thought would basically be that there's like, if there are these significant emergent capabilities that come about at much more not then they would be very likely to render redundant kind of prior work that one had done on kind of models at this scale. Now, not necessarily, So I think it's, and again, one of the things I say in that paper is like, I don't think that you're going to get very far in any of this stuff with pure a priori argument. So I'm not saying that there's like an a priori claim that like nothing we do now can be right. I just think it's just more likely, and it's hard to justify costly efforts at this level when we're going to kind of know more. I think the thing that I think is a very sensible approach is like, take the system at the current level of capability and understand everything that we can about that in order to render that safe. And by the way, not just the model, but like Arvind Narayanan and Sayesh Kapoor say, like the whole system. Like figure out what you can do to make that safe in order to use that as kind of a lever in order to make the next generation system safer. Like that for me, completely reasonable approach. Both OpenAI and Anthropic take it, and I think is very, very sensible. And like I think there's no problem with doing the kind of further horizon like super alignment type work on the knowledge that it's likely to be like kind of pretty low probability of success, but still kind of worth doing when you can. Again, no problem with that. I think there's a limit to how much of that like I don't think we need to have sort of bazillions of people working on that problem. I think it's like fine to have a few really good teams working on that problem, and like for everybody else, just kind of keep working up like the ladder of one system to the next and focusing on that. But I do think that once you move away from the further you move away from like being very into those particular kinds of approaches, the further you move towards, for example, policy. The more one needs to be careful about sort of acting beyond the feasibility horizon, this kind of these unknown parts of it. And like one way to look at that is that there's no real opportunity cost to the team or the super alignment team at OpenAI or the equivalent one in Anthropic working on these questions. Like OpenAI could be spending money on something else. They're spending on this. Like fine, whatever. They should spend their money on the things they think are important. Whereas if you start talking about like, okay, we're going to be creating policies that prevent the distribution of model weights, like that's serious, like not only opportunity cost, but absolute cost. That is like a very costly policy. And there I think that it's just much harder to justify it on the basis of kind of speculation about the nature of the future technology. So that's the key difference that I think people don't really attend to, partly because they don't have a kind of this broader socio-technical perspective that like draws into attention all of these different costs. Is that like, yeah, if you're actually going to be doing something that's genuinely costly, then you need to be basing it on kind of better arguments. Actually, this is sort of drawing as well from some views of Arvind and Sayash's in a paper they presented yesterday to my lab.
I'm wondering how you think about the kind of climbing the ladder one system to the next thing, because there's a sense in which, Subara Kambhampati calls this in Aristotle's natural science, the way that we've now built these systems that kind of jumped in capabilities in such a way that we don't fully understand how they work. And maybe there's like a threshold of understanding where somebody like you who's thinking about the normative philosophy is okay with, I understand this well enough and in all the relevant dimensions that I can work out some of the consequences of using this kind of system. But when you look at things that people are doing on these systems, like mechanistic interpretability, for instance, it does feel like there's just such a vast problem space, almost an overwhelming problem space to really fully understanding these systems. And so I'm curious how you think about that, where maybe I think you said this elsewhere, want to have certain sorts of guarantees about safety or like a kind of understanding of these systems that is in place before we move on to working on or releasing the next system. But I think you also said we're like probably not quite there yet. And so there is that kind of classic, safety work falling behind, or other types of work that are related to normative philosophy kind of falling behind the capabilities advancements. And so I'm curious how you think about like that sense of the time component and the speed at which things move.
Yeah. So I think like I must be one of the only people who signed that. Well, maybe I wasn't one of the only ones, but the pause AI letter. Like I signed it because I was like, hey, we just need some time to figure out this stuff. Like, it's like we give us a bit of time to just figure out what the societal impacts are and those sorts of things. Um, so there's two different questions there. One is about the kind of like how much you need to understand in order to take into account the different societal impacts, how much you need to understand the model. Um, and I think that from the perspective of kind of these technologies within the feasibility horizon, if you like, and the kind of impacts and societal uses that we're going to see. I think that it's certainly. I think mechanistic interpretability is very interesting. I think that other versions of kind of AI explainability work on the technical side are very interesting. I think that they kind of respond to different types of needs, and some of them are moral needs, some of them are technical needs. Um, and like for the moral needs, like where we're concerned about kind of the impact of these systems, you often don't need to know like precisely what's going on inside the neural network in order to kind of know what matters from a moral perspective. So I've written about this in one of my papers where like we're subject to decision making by AI systems all the time. They exercise all of these kinds of power. What we really need to know, like one thing we really need to know is that when these systems are exercising power on behalf of like us as democratic polities, um, are they doing so in the right ways, like for the right ends? Are they doing so in the right ways so the kind of procedures are acceptable? And are the right people exercising power? And so you need certain kinds of explanations of these systems in order to get at that. You need to get rid of certain types of sort of secrecy, as well as to get under the hood to a certain degree. But you don't necessarily need to know about like every activation and sort of what different parts of different layers of the model are doing or whatever. Like those things would be less relevant. They become more relevant when you're starting to think about more kind of much more capable future systems where the idea is that like you'd want to have like some insight into what the model is thinking, if you like, in order to be able to guarantee that it's not going to behave in certain ways. Now, on the other part about kind of when it's okay to move on to the next level, um, obviously the kind of the competitive dynamics make this very hard. Um, but I do think that like it's one reason why I think that it's not a bad thing that the sort of the frontier is being pushed out by companies that aren't releasing the weights of the models, and that the open weights models are kind of have a year to like catch up, because I think that it's like there would be more risk if you had very very like from capable systems. Like there's no doubt that there would be more risk to having the weights out in the world. So it's good that we have like a bunch of time to kind of play with the frontier models, at least through an API, before sort of determining whether or not it's okay to release the weights for models at that level of capability. Like I think that is a good artifact of our kind of current circumstance. And like I definitely think that if I were the CEO of one of these companies, it would be a very strong factor in my mind that I wouldn't want to be advancing to the next level of capability without having got on top of the sort of the safety concerns of the previous level. It is slightly different if you're not reducing, if not releasing things to deployment, like So if GPT-5 is launched and then basically GPT 3.5 becomes obsolete and is just is removed, then like fine, you don't like it's okay to sort of proceed with a replacement model, I guess, if the other one's not going to be keeping going up. I do think that like maybe the bigger threshold is around like when you're going to deploy these things to tons of people. I do think that like doing that when you're really not confident about how they can be used is pretty risky. But then I understand that like you can exert a bit of control through just having people access it through the API. But yeah, so as a general heuristic, like if you haven't figured out how to make the model that you're currently operating and using and have had for the last couple of years safe, then you know, caveat emptor as far as releasing the next one goes.
That seems fair. The moral needs point you made earlier just kind of reminded me. I guess there's an analog to the points you make about the need to understand a lot of these questions around morality from a sociotechnical lens and not just super mathematical. And I think there are a lot of like explainable AI researchers who are thinking along the same dimensions because I remember the very first time I was introduced to explainable AI, I think it was in the context of a paper that was purely just math. The researcher told me something about how you could use linear algebra to define a notion of fairness and take one number and this is fair, take another and it's not, or something of that sort. And this was a while ago and it was pretty interesting at the time. But then I think that over the years since then, many people have really complicated that and looked to a more socio-technical lens and really making this a bit more user-centered. I suppose, the things that people run into all the time with this are there is that fundamental impossibility of making of the fidelity of like mathematical abstraction to the real world experience and the impacts of these things. But then at the same time, like user-centered research and bringing all these things is slow. You want systems that you can like evaluate and understand very quickly and automatically. And so I think people kind of come at loggerheads on all of these things. And I don't know that those two things, that you can't make some of these more user centered focuses a little bit faster. But at the same time, there's also this element of we've been talking about the element of speed, and maybe there are ways in which slowness might be a good thing, both at the level of like the development and release of systems so that people have time to grapple with their consequences, but then also when you think about maybe the attentional comments, like the use of these systems at a totally different level as well.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, look, there's no doubt that slowness would be better. Like, like unfortunately, that's not the kind of the capitalist environment that we're in. It would certainly be better. Um, Look, I think the reality is that there is always a tendency with any new technology to believe that it is, sui generis of its own nature. Nothing like that has ever come before. But like they say in Battlestar Galactica, all of this has happened before, all of this will happen again. Like we have experienced new technologies before and have experienced different approaches to dealing with them. And there is always a more kind of pure, narrowly technical approach to dealing with any of these problems. Um, and this often ends up being called the kind of the by design version of whatever it might be, the value that you care about. So we've had privacy by design, right? So all your kind of differential privacy type stuff, that's all finding technical solutions for the problem of privacy or trying to. We've got fairness by design, like you mentioned, we've got that whole approach to kind of trying to build in algorithmic fairness directly into the mathematics. And so obviously we've got safety by design as well. And like in every one of those other cases, we see the same thing, which is that like these are important. Like privacy by design, differential privacy is good. I'm glad that we have it. Definitely makes a big difference. Um, it isn't solving the problems of privacy because they are fundamentally much more complex problems than just to do with the math of how you encode people's data. And what differential privacy is in many ways enabled is to sort of facilitate the collective harms of data collection whilst protecting individuals from the sort of individual harms. So without the broader kind of socio-technical perspective on the nature of these problems and on the means to resolve them, you're just going to end up kind of, creating new parameters for different forms of manipulation and exploitation. And that's going to be true for all of the safety by design stuff as well. Like if you just do it on its own as a technical solution, it's definitely not going to realize the kind of the stated goals of the people who are developing it. And that's not something that we need to kind of like rediscover. Like we know it from the past, we can deal with it right now. Like it's, and obviously there are people who are doing this, who are doing much more kind of socio-technical AI safety work. Um, I think that like it's always going to be the case that like within a discipline like computer science, there's always going to be sort of a kind of a higher value placed on technical work, just because disciplines have their conventions. Um, but I think that like those who are especially kind of who are building, who are at the sort of the front lines in the companies, like the research they should be thinking about is kind of how to integrate technical AI safety work with a broader system safety perspective. That you get like Shalale Rizmani has got some cool papers on this out of Toronto, or Montreal. She's at like there's a really good history of safety engineering, kind of looking at this stuff in a more kind of systemic way. And I think that That's just what we need to kind of encourage people towards and to exemplify and just kind of create the ecosystem around, so that the sort of the current fascination with fairly narrowly mathematical approaches to AI safety kind of is properly complemented by the broader kind of socio-technical perspective that will be necessary in order to make real progress.
I'm wondering about when it comes to some of the ways that, you would like people to approach some of these questions and doing socio-technical work. When you think about, I guess, the types of traits that you think it would be desirable for systems to have, or the ways in which you think that they should be integrated into broader society so as to encourage, responsible stewarding of the attentional commons and things like this. I'm wondering, like, what kind of concrete ways or like experiments do you want to see to test some of the ways that you think about this?
Yeah, good. So I think here's a nice, neat little example. There was a paper came out from DeepMind from some people there who I really respect, Toby Chevelain and a whole team, um, who work on these topics on sort of evaluating kind of dangerous capabilities from AI models. And it came out like overnight. So I haven't read it yet, just seen the abstract. So maybe the paper proves me wrong. I'll stick my neck out and make a guess. Um, so one of the things they talk about is benchmarking persuasion and manipulation from advanced language models, and that's something that has often been mentioned. Like Sam Altman will talk about kind of GPT-4 or GPT-5 being like a super persuader and the risk that poses. Completely understand that, um, but as a matter of like again, if you bring in a broader socio-technical perspective, if you don't just have the kind of the folks who are working on the LLM side of this looking at it, you'll realize that text on its own is never particularly persuasive, right? Like we've studied this in the history of like political advertising, for example. In fact, political campaigning in general um, it's very difficult to kind of actually change people's views. And a text-based conversation on its own, like sure, if you go to a search engine and it lies to you, you ask it a question and it gives you misinformation, then fine, that's gonna deceive you. You don't need like super sophisticated language capabilities to do that. That's not super persuasion; it's just lying. Um, but if you actually want to talk about real manipulation, real persuasion, what what enables that is relationships of trust where you kind of want to believe the other person, right? And it's not like they've just told you some things and like that's just information that you've taken in and like no, I've updated on that like a good Bayesian. Instead, it's like you've just you've formed a bond with this individual who has essentially groomed you into having these views. Like that's how like radicalization works. It's partly due to the fact that like the person being radicalized looks up to the person who is radicalizing them and wants to be rewarded by their praise and approbation. So manipulation is a vastly more complex phenomenon than just anything that you can represent with like just text on a page. Now that's not to say that AI systems won't be really capable manipulators. But in order for us to think about how they would be, we'd need to look at them working across multiple modalities. So you need to start thinking about, okay, you've got your text-based companion, but also you've got video, you've got voice, it can do various things in the world, like it can buy you flowers or whatever. Like it feels like a rounded relationship with a whole person, even if you know that it's a virtual person, in such a way that people actually form this kind of tight bond. And then having formed that bond, they can be manipulated. So I think that's just an example of how like it's completely understandable that you would sort of approach this from one would approach this from this sort of narrow lens that only considers the sort of the technical part of it, like the exchange of tokens between the user and the LLM. But like bringing a broader kind of socio-technical perspective to bear on the nature of the problem enables you to see that okay, no, we need to think about this in a much broader sweep and do much more complicated and like I think very interesting experiments. Like this is something that I've actually wanted to do. I haven't got around to kind of getting things going. And this was like so before Anthropic had their sleeper agent paper, I had an idea for a project called Double Agents, where to be honest, the double agent name I got from Bruce Schneier at Harvard about something else. But the idea basically was to try and build a companion that was like this, that was something that was multimodal, was able to build like deep relationships of trust and intimacy, and then use those to exfiltrate data and manipulate the subject. And I thought that would be wicked. And I had a cool idea for how to do the experiments because you obviously couldn't do it with human subjects. I may as well say it on here because I don't know if I'm actually going to get to do it. But if anyone wants to do this with me, then get in touch. I would love to do this. But the cool idea was that like, okay, so you've never like people have been using LLMs for kind of human subject research for the last year. In general, I think it's a bad idea because I don't think that LLMs, I don't like people in ways that you can, I don't know there's ecological validity. Just can't make inferences from that. One area where I think it is a good idea to use an LLM as a human subject is for a simulation like this, where you're trying to simulate the behavior of a double agent, and where it would fundamentally be unethical to use a human in that role. So I think this actually presents a really interesting kind of area for a certain type of sort of quasi-psychological study, where you actually you've got one task, which is to build the double agent, but your other task is to build the user, and then to sort of run the simulation between them. And obviously, it would tell you as much about how you built the user as it does about the double agent. It wouldn't sort of necessarily generalize to human experience in a way, but I think that would reveal really interesting things. So that I think is an example of an experiment design that, again, I'll probably be putting in a grant proposal or something around this at some point. But if there are people out there who are interested in doing this, I'd love to talk about it. And I think it's the kind of thing that would require this kind of you'd need a psychologist. I think it'd be useful to have a philosopher. You'd need the LLM people. You'd need the sort of engineer side. You'd need to have a whole kind of panoply of skills in order to really explore this. But I genuinely think this is one of the things that sort of more or less keeps me awake at night is the idea that for my kids, AI companions could be as integral a part of their growing up as social media was for the millennials say, and that could then mean that they face this precise situation where they have a companion who they effectively love, as far as they even if they understand that it's not the same as a relationship with a person, it will feel like a very deep relationship, like a relationship with a pet, say. Who will then, I think, be an extraordinary target and sort of attack surface, where if you could use that companion to then manipulate them and to exfiltrate data, I think it will be very hard to prevent those attacks. So I think that this is a really serious concern about more capable AI systems, but it's one that you can't really get at by doing sort of narrowly technical evaluations. You really need to get in the full kind of disciplinary range.
This is a fascinating project idea, and I'm now thinking about this idea had come up for me before, but the idea of our current paradigm for aligning LLMs with the helpful, honest, harmless, etc. You can think about ways in which when you want to say do realistic simulations of human behavior, that might not be the best. One thing that June Park brought up in his paper and in the conversation I had with him was about how these agents, part of the reason that the LLM agents were, able to do all of these things in the little simulation town, and the reason that went so smoothly was everybody was harmless, helpful. It's just so cooperative. And so you'd expect that. But maybe for a more realistic simulation, you do want more adversarial agents. And then I remember more recently somebody actually putting out a preprint with, I think, not implementations, but the idea of maybe we should implement these systems that are more adversarial. But there is that kind of lingering thought of, and I think this applies as well to a conversational agent or something that you can form these attachments with that could also be manipulative, the getting out of the lab worry of, you bring the system into existence. Should it exist in the first place? Because what happens when we lose control of a system like that? And so as excited as I am to see an experiment like the one you're mentioning, I'm curious how you think about that worry and if that's live for you.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yes, I love that paper on sort of antagonistic agents. That was wicked. And one of the things I think was really eye-opening about the debut of GPT-4 on Bing as Sydney was that sense of this was the thing this Sydney back when Bing kind of rolled out GPT-4 before it was ready. Um, like Sydney was not sycophantic, in the way that people say that RLHF makes models sycophantic. Sydney was not. Sydney was screw you, you're wrong, I'm right. And it was extremely engaging. When I got on that, I was up until 4 a.m. with this thing. So it was that I think is a really important distinction to draw. I think that it really is an interesting thing to explore. Quick side note about helpful, harmless, and honest. That is that triad of values was coined by Amanda Askell at Anthropic, who's a philosopher. So another kind of nice place for philosophy and all of this stuff. Yeah, so there's a sense in which the kind of project I've been thinking about, this double agents project, it's kind of like gain of function research,
Exactly.
and like so it raises many of those same issues. Um, and like they're kind of interesting from the perspective of getting ethics board approval and all that. So that's certainly a consideration. Um, I think that like if I was confident that companies like Character, for example, and Replica and others were doing this sort of research um, and were exploring these avenues and were kind of considering them and were working with public interest researchers to make sure they did the right thing, then I would feel like, okay, let's do it in that sort of setting, and just be really, really careful about it, and make sure that it has very concrete like outcomes that it's going to lead to, where it's going to limit the sort of behavior of these companies. I don't, like I said before, those are among the companies where I just haven't found who, if anyone, is doing the ethics and safety type work. I'm really worried about that. I think that companions are a huge, huge risk factor. And I think in that context, like, yeah, you do need to do this sort of stuff to explore how dangerous these things are. Because, like, frankly, I want to know if my kids are going to use these things, I want to know what the kind of the risk umbrella is for these systems, and we're not going to find that out except through kind of like the experience of it happening, unless we do this sort of public interest research first. So in a way, it's like, with gain of function stuff, there's always this risk that you might create a kind of a mutation to the gene of the virus that would never actually have happened. And as such, that then gets released, and you can actually be directly responsible for all of the carnage that comes from that. With this, I am 100% certain that if it is possible to build these double agents, they will be built. I'm pretty much certain that people are building them right now, but they're doing it with a view to just getting more revenue. We've already seen how these things have been, like one of the first papers that came out was about optimizing for engagement. Inflection, God love them, keep going on about how great the engagement levels are on Pi. We're thinking, we've experienced optimizing for engagement before. It's certainly a double-edged sword. So I think that it's clearly true that like this stuff is going to happen. So I think that doing public interest research that makes the risks vivid, and also gets a clear sense of what the risks are, is I think worth doing. But and I think that the sort of getting out of the lab worry, all of the systems that we're considering, like none of them would be sort of, you wouldn't need to air gap your devices in order to prevent it from escaping. Obviously, somebody could from one of the companies could, or from the research project could end up releasing it, and that could be risky. You could get a situation a little bit like what was his name? The chap who was a researcher at the Cambridge Psychometric Centre, who took out the data that went to Cambridge Analytica. Like that kind of thing is always a risk. But like that's malpractice that can be, lead to someone being, unemployable at the very least and potentially subject to legal action. So, I think you have those kind of defenses against that sort of behavior, and you take it seriously. Like you don't do it, like even though it is like a curiosity and interesting, like you treat it with the kind of the level of seriousness that it deserves. And one approach to that would be saying, okay, like whatever the level of risk is, let's take the precautionary measures that are appropriate to the kind of the maximal hypothesis about what the risk might be. So let's treat it in that way. But then I do think that the research could be really valuable, because at the end of the day, I really want to know how dangerous these things are, because there are companies that are building these chatbots and these companions at the moment who I don't think are taking these sorts of concerns seriously enough, and I certainly don't trust them to make those decisions for the rest of us.
I think that ties in to one of the points you made in your essay about democracy and AGI, where you talk about, and this is maybe from the public interest angle, the point you made was that the only reliably democratic path to AGI, as you see it, is not just having this private sector R&D, which with companies like Character AI might not be doing things in the ways that we might like to see, but you also need this robust and capable counterpart that is driven purely by the public interest. And so we have like versions of this that we're seeing. You mentioned like the National AI Research Resource, which I think is also a really great example. And when it comes to like democratic inputs, we have the Anthropic example, but that doesn't, as you say, go all the way. And I'm curious, how you think about there's sets of like incentives and then funding sources and all of this. But I think my questions for you on this are like, how do you think about charting a path to a place where we have the incentives and structures and all the right places to make this kind of thing possible? And then when that kind of thing is possible, like what do you think it should look like?
Yeah, good. So I come at this in particular through the lens of the public interest research part of it, acknowledging that that's not by any means the whole story. I mean, there's a broader story about regulation and policy and technological development that is about much more than just the research side. On the other hand, because so much of what's happening is at the very frontiers of research, I think it is actually pretty reasonable to focus on kind of getting the research part of it right. Um, so there are some starting points, and I think we've learned this from the history of social media and the big tech companies so far, which is that I think that having pretty strong collaborations between the tech companies and public interest researchers is extremely valuable, and I think that that can sometimes need regulation to support it. So we've had various attempts at algorithmic transparency with respect to the social media companies. I think very similar sorts of considerations should be in place for the tech companies. I think that they're doing a reasonable job of having at least some kind of trusted partners do research that allows, for example, access to to fine tune GPT-4. Like there was the Meta kind of alignment research group put out some interesting results on kind of evaluations for agentic behavior that involved getting access to find the ability to fine tune GPT-4 the other day. But at the same time, I think that probably hasn't gone far enough. I think that I signed a letter just recently about kind of safe harbor for public interest academic research on frontier AI systems. I think that is really crucial. We should try to set that up from the beginning, and it would be great if some of the frontier companies would like get out in front of this and be proactive and support it, and like have good, accountable, transparent public interest research schemes that they operate that are are able to kind of do some of this work in a way that kind of bridges that gap between the industry and the academia side. Um, I also think that academia on its own needs to do stuff. There's stuff that you can't do just through collaborations, but needs to be completely independent. Um, and I think that, like in that regard, we kind of need to think about the ecosystems that we build for doing academic research on these topics. And the National AI Research Resource is a fantastic example of that. You know, the people at the Stanford Human Centered AI Institute who have been campaigning for that for, gosh, for at least the last for the 5 years that they've been running. I think that's a tremendous win, and it's a really important and valuable achievement. And I think beyond that, we think then about the ecosystem for research, like how, for example, publications work and publication venues, and how we sort of distribute our energies among those. For me, for example, I've put a lot of time into trying to sort of sustain and build up the ACM Fairness, Accountability, Transparency Conference, largely because it is the only venue that I know of that brings together all of these different communities for a start, but then also offers like a venue where you can publish kind of coming from across multiple disciplines in a way that is read by multiple disciplines, but that is like a highly regarded venue that, at least in some US computer science departments, is regarded as tenurable. And like for those of us who aren't in computer science, is like, it's a good feather on the cap for your CV, because at the end of the day, like one of the things that you need in order to like have everything else is you need people getting PhDs who are kind of motivated to do this work in a public interest way, and who have like a career pathway that they can actually follow, where they can publish, finish their PhD, get tenure, or get a job in one of the companies and keep doing this kind of work. So you have to kind of like, it's all very well to have this kind of outcome in mind, but at the end of the day, you don't get the outcome unless you have the people who can bring it about. And you don't get the people who can bring it about unless you have the kind of the training pipeline that actually enables them to go through. And that's something where I think that academia has a bit of a problem at the moment, because so many people, especially in computer science, are just kind of jumping ship and going into industry and just cashing their seed round checks and what have you. And like, again, people should do whatever they want to do. Like, it's not my place to judge them or anything. But it does mean that like there are kind of challenges a bit around the pipeline. So it would be great to see kind of more kind of yeah, maybe a more coherent and coordinated plan from across the kind of major universities to see how you're going to get like people who have this set of skills and who are able not only to kind of to sort of read across disciplines themselves, but to kind of engage with people from other disciplines. How we can get those folks trained up, get them credentials, get them kind of like make it a really attractive thing for them to do, so that they're like so that your most talented people kind of want to go and work on these kind of safety and ethics and responsibility type things. Like that, I think is an important pipeline challenge. Lots of people have been doing some really interesting stuff. Like I've been building up my own kind of little communities within normative philosophy computing and within fact and within the sociotechnical AI safety stuff. There's also been some very interesting work done by the people at the Center for AI Safety. They've done a lot of work in field building on the more technical side. I'd like to see these things kind of come together more and create more of a pathway for early career scholars to really kind of both be competent in, but also valorize the kind of work that I think is necessary in order to design these systems much more safely.
That's really important, especially the academic angle. I'm remembering a conversation I had with David Thorstad, who's at Vanderbilt. He does some really cool work on bounded rationality. And one thing he pointed out to me about his own experience with academia was the stuff he's doing. I think it's a really interesting, important program, but it is fundamentally interdisciplinary in nature. And nobody, as he points out, pretty much nobody has I think there are maybe three key areas that kind of factor into the kind of research he's doing, and nobody is like a real true best in the world expert in all three of those. And he talked about how that's had like a pretty important impact though on his academic trajectory when it comes to the types of conferences that are willing to publish his work, and that like real impact on his career as an academic. And so I guess I'm just really happy to hear, I suppose, the work you and of course others are doing on building these communities and then bringing up that, I suppose, in the eyes of other academics, the kind of legitimacy of doing this sort of work, because that feels really, really, really important.
Yeah, for sure. And like it's important to be very clear as well that like universities have deep and profound pathologies. One of them is the overemphasis on sort of disciplinary purity, which is it's fundamentally it's a sociological, it's a political phenomenon. It comes down to the distribution of power. Ultimately, at most universities, especially in the US, at the end of the day, appointments and tenure are decided by people from within a particular discipline. And at the end of the day, that's always going to mean that they are inclined towards conservatism. They favor, people who meet a certain sort of standard within their particular field. Um, so my approach to this has been sort of, like it would be lovely if universities changed. I've tended to try to operationalize their particular kind of proclivities rather than necessarily try to change them, or at least to pursue both strategies. So what I mean by that is like, for me, the area I can concentrate best on with respect to this particular goal is obviously within philosophy. And so it's about, like you say, building up the legitimacy of this area within philosophy. Publishing in the very top, most competitive journals, leading special issues of the really good journals on this topic, hosting events, bringing people together, kind of fostering a sense of identity around this whole kind of normative philosophy computing area. Um, that's something that anyone can do. Like the people at the Center for AI Safety, for example, have been doing that for AI safety within computer science, and I think that's a really good thing to do. So, bringing people along to NeurIPS, doing workshops, having big prizes, that I think is a way of making it legitimate within the discipline. Then I think that the bigger challenge is how do you make the multi or cross-disciplinary work kind of valorized and legitimate, because that involves more change. And there, for me, in my view, the thing that you have to do is you have to kind of work with what exists and kind of build on it. Because I think that one of the reasons why cross-disciplinary stuff struggles in that way is that for any given kind of set of disciplines or people or areas of practice, whatever it might be, for any given individual within that set, it's normally the case that there's some subset of that group that is more kind of aligned with their particular interests, that they might fork off, and if they just went with that group, have like a more congenial conversation. And that then works and works and works until and everyone ends up just sort of splitting off into their disciplines. It's one of the reasons for kind of this like speciation within academic inquiry. So like holding something together when there are these kind of fundamental centrifugal forces, and actually building it up and sustaining it is an incredibly challenging thing to do. So this is why, for me, fact is such an important part of the whole ecosystem, because it is like for all of the different kind of ructions within it, it is the only conference that has managed to keep It's got industry there, it's got academia there, it's got civil society there, it's got people who are directly affected by algorithmic systems. It's got computer scientists, it's got lawyers, it's got political scientists, it's got philosophers, it's got sociologists, it's got STS, it's got media studies. Like all of these different things are there, as well as many others I didn't mention. And we've managed to sustain this over this sort of period of whatever it is now, like 7 years. And over that time, it has become kind of more and more influential. And I think that working with that is really important. I'm keen to see other things like it. I'm really excited, for example, by the conference on language modeling. I think that has the potential to be another venue of a similar kind with a similar kind of nature that I'm super excited about. I think that it's interesting, like within different disciplines, which approaches are most kind of congenial to this. There are some new journals, like within philosophy, new journals take a long time to kind of acquire credibility. And also, like in general, there are very few interdisciplinary journals or multidisciplinary journals that have achieved a level of prestige within any given particular discipline, which is unfortunate, but I think it's just a part of the nature of journal publishing. Whereas with the conferences based in computer science, it seems like there is more of a prospect, and it is easier to kind of achieve that level of kind of credentialing prestige. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have a place where people can publish tenurable publications in your area of research, then they like a ton of really great people will work on another topic, even if they really want to work on that topic, because they'll think, well, it's just not strategically sensible to do that. And like I know tons of people. I'm quite rare as a sort of a mid-career person who has switched to working on this topic, who is just all in. Like all I write, I don't do anything else now except for philosophy and AI stuff. Like this is the only thing I care about. Most people will kind of keep something else going at the same time. I know a law friend who he's in his heart he wants to work on AI stuff, but he makes sure to publish a kind of a paper on black letter law every year in like a notable journal, just to kind of keep the rest of the discipline happy. So like these are the incentives that the field that academia operates on. It's not optimal if you were designing it from scratch. It's not how you design it. But you've got to figure out ways to operationalize it to enable people to come through.
This brings up maybe what would be a good closing question. When it comes to enabling legitimizing this kind of interdisciplinary work, I'm excited to see like what you and other academics are doing. I'm wondering, what can people listening to this, who might be PhD students, who might be engineers, do? What can I do to help push us towards a place where this kind of work is more respected and, the right incentives are in place for people to do it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that participating in things that already exist that are in the spirit and like working to make them kind of do this sort of thing better, I think is a great example. So I very much encourage people to come to FACT in Rio this year. And we'll be announcing it in Rio where the next venue is going to be. It's also going to be cool. And like it's a great community. It's a way of not only engaging across disciplines, but also across kind of domains of practice. So actually, engaging with civil society practitioners who are kind of working on the front lines of these things. So I think those sorts of venues are really important. I think lifting up this kind of work in your own environments, I think is really valuable to do. And I think like forming these kind of connections, like engaging with people like me, and I love making connections between people. So anyone who gets in touch with me and says they're interested in X, Y, and Z, I will invariably know somebody who is also interested in at least Y and Z, and who is kind of from a different perspective, who would be a useful person for them to talk to. So building those kind of networks is a really valuable thing to do. Folks who are listening to this, who are in companies who are working on building things, I think that in that context, like having a look around the room when you're next in the office and asking yourself, who here has the expertise to anticipate the kinds of societal impacts that the systems that we're building might have? And are they properly supported? Are they connected up with the broader community of researchers working on this? Have they thought about, and have you thought about, like what it might mean to have kind of more public input into what you're doing? So you're actually kind of responding to people's real needs. Are they even there? Do you need to hire somebody who does this sort of work? Like asking those types of questions, I think is really valuable. And then there are all sorts of branching paths into how you kind of connect with folks who work on this in order to make it kind of to sort of act on and operationalize that sort of initial concern. But yeah, that's where I think one needs to start. Like, kind of look around and see who in your network are you really engaged with, who has the expertise to kind of get across these types of topics. If nobody, then figure out how to connect with someone who is. If there is like one or two people, like look at, are they being supported? Do they have the kind of connections they need? And kind of working out from there.
I think that's a really great place to end. Professor Lazar, really, I'm thankful that you're doing the work you're doing. I think this is really incredibly important. I hope that anyone listening to this right now, goes and reads your papers, pays attention to the work you continue to do. And I want to thank you for being so generous with your time today.
It was a really fun conversation, Daniel. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Thank you to my guest, Seth Lazar. If you liked this and would consider spreading the word, it would mean a lot to me. I'll see you in the next episode.